This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project for the Library of Congress. The veteran's name is Russell Ashmore. He was born on November 3rd, 1929. He served in Germany during the Korean War. He achieved the rank of captain. We are recording this on May 30th, 2015. I'm Will Hines and conducting this interview. So, Mr. Ashmore, can you talk about being raised in Greenville and growing up and kind of what experience that was?
Well, my family has always been in the construction business, road construction. Mm-hmm. My grandfather was a grading contractor and lost his business in the Big Depression. Mm-hmm. And my dad started over on his own in 1930 with a used Mack chain drive truck, a pick, and 2 shovels. And landscaping business and hauling whatever he could haul. And of course that's been nearly 85 years ago now.
So
the 3rd generation is running the business now. We're Ashmore Brothers Inc. We're a heavy highway construction people. We do work for the State Highway Department, as well as we were fortunate we did such work as BMW, Michigan, their parking areas and grading. We are one of the few contractors that's still what we call turnkey. We can go in and do anything that has to be done in the exterior. Grading, paving, curb and gutter work, drainage, all of that sort of thing. So
how was it in Greenville during the Depression?
Well, we didn't realize we were that bad off. But my dad, when he started over, found out he couldn't afford to rent a place on Oregon Street, which is off of Augusta Road. So we moved in with my mother's parents, who were dairy farmers down at Boonville. And we were down there from the time I was about 3 years old until I was nearly 6. We lived with them. And I didn't, and being on a farm, you don't realize that you're not well off. Because you raise your own food and all of that sort of thing, and you don't realize how bad it was. But my dad had it pretty tough until the latter part of the 1930 period, about 1939, he began to make enough money that he was able to buy his first power shovel. And he dug the basement for what's currently the federal building on the corner of Washington Street and I forget the name of the other street, but anyway, it's on the corner of Washington Street.
So
he did his first power shovel digging a basement for that facility.
So how was it in Greenville during the war, during World War II?
Well, the biggest thing that most folks felt was kinfolks who were being called into service. I lost a cousin off the coast of Evil Yemen, and a destroyer escort was attacked by kamikaze planes. And I had 2 other cousins who were on the ground in Europe. Took place in the battle of taking Germany and so forth. In fact, one of my cousins, who later became Greenville County supervisor, was his unit, his squad was the first squad across the river at Remagen, which was the only bridge that the Germans didn't blow up crossing the Rhine River. And so you were anxious about folks who were in service. I had 3 uncles and 3 cousins who were in the war at some phase. 2 of them were Well, three of them were actually in the war against Japan, and three of them were against the war in Germany.
Are any of your cousins still living?
No. No, one of them is still living, that's right. Billy is still living. He was in the combat engineers. Lives down in Greenwood. He's a Clemson grad. He'd be a good one to interview.
Yeah. So, was there a lot of rationing during the war?
Yes. And that was the biggest thing at home, was attempting to... 864230467. Excuse me. This is my daughter.
Oh, she. So, we were talking about rationing and not being able to purchase things.
That's the biggest thing I think that folks in our area felt. If it wasn't from some person being in service and keeping up with what they were doing, the rationing was the biggest thing that you had to be careful of. In fact, at one point I still had a ration book that my mother had. It was upstairs somewhere, packed away. But knowing that you had the particular gas, which made you much more careful about how you planned your trips and where you were going and so forth and so on. And so that's the gas ration was the biggest problem.
And so you grow up and you decide to go to Clemson.
Yeah, I was attracted to Clemson when I was just a little boy. My uncle, who was in World War II, my mother's brother was a cadet at Clemson, and we used to go for the Mother's Day parades. And I was so enthralled with the military that I knew that's where I wanted to go to school. So,
Well, you were probably there when a lot of World War II veterans were there as well.
Well, that's the thing. In fact, my class, we're getting ready to have our 65th reunion in June. And our class was a little different from most classes. We were roughly a third single veterans, a third married veterans, and a third cadets. And so the cohesiveness was not there in that class like you would have in other classes, because there were very diverse groups. We had a lot of returning veterans. In fact, two of my cousins that were in Europe had their college interrupted to go in during the war, and were in the class of 48 before me. We were there roughly at the same time, even though they were older than I was. And so the cohesiveness was not there in those classes like you have now.
So you graduate from Clemson, you go through the ROTC program, graduate from Clemson, and you are commissioned into the military.
Yes, I was a little bit different than some of them. I finished Clemson when I was 20, and they wouldn't give me my commission until I turned 21.
That's unusual.
I thought it was too. But so I got my commission in November, and I got my orders to report to Fort Benning in January, to report in March to Fort Benning, Georgia, to the 4th Infantry Division, that's where they were located at that time.
And did you go through, at ROTC program, do you go into basic training after that, or have you already gone through basic?
We had already done that.
Okay.
You do that your junior year.
Okay.
We had already been through that type of training and so forth.
And so did you know you'd be assigned to armored cavalry?
Yeah, I was commissioned in armor. In other words, the commissions were infantry, artillery and armored cavalry and signal, I believe, were the main division that you could be commissioned in.
And so you went to Fort Benning, Georgia. And what did you go through any training there? What?
Well, like I say, we didn't do a great deal of training because they were packing up to go overseas. I would have gone quicker than I did, except that we found out that the artillery ranges at Fort Benning would not accommodate tank fire. So they had to load up all the tank commanders, cannoneers. The cannoneers are the one who put the shells in the tube, and the gunners. And they shipped us all to Fort Hood, Texas, so we could qualify on the big guns.
And so what was your job in the tank?
I was a tank platoon leader.
Okay.
In other words, I had 5 tanks in a platoon. They were heavy tanks. At that time, they were the first tanks we had were the old Sherman tanks that they had during World War II. Later on, we had the M26, and even later the M42, M41. But when we started, we had the old Sherman tanks.
Old Shermans from leftover.
Yeah.
And so you commanded 5 tanks, and what would you do when you were in the tank? Were you were you out up top? Were you radioing other tanks?
I had a little bit of a strange situation. I don't know how much detail you want on this, but when I reported to the colonel, he wanted to know what my background was, and of course I told him construction, because I cut my first road when I was 12 years old. And he said, great. I was commissioned in armor, and I was expecting to be a platoon leader of a tank platoon. He said, you'll make a perfect supply platoon leader. So I ended up, with 40 trucks hauling ammunition and gasoline to the tanks that were scattered all over Germany when we got there. So I was with headquarters company to start with. But we had an incident that took place. We had one of the line companies, as we call them, B company, that I ended up in, was on the range, and whether, I don't know whether you know it or not, but tanks can be used for indirect fire as well as direct fire. They can be used as artillery pieces. And so they were practicing artillery. And the lieutenant who was in charge of that particular platoon made an error. Instead of depressing the piece 100 mils, he elevated 100 mils, which was a 200 mil error, and he fired a shot, landed it on the Russians. And you talk about creating turmoil. I mean, I've never seen so much brass in my life that showed up over that incident. You didn't hear anything about it in the news because they got it. They got a hold of the Russians and told them what had happened. It was an accident and so forth. Of course, that lieutenant got canned.
Well, yeah, that could have started something huge.
That's
I mean,
right. It could.
Yeah.
But I ended up with his platoon.
So you took his place.
Yeah.
So you train at Fort Hood, and then once you get out there, they're already ready to head out, right?
Yeah.
And so you head directly to Germany, or did you make any stops along the way?
We landed in Bremerhaven, Germany, and shipped us down to a staging area where the situation. A lot of folks don't realize how tense it was at that time. We had the Korean War going on, But what took place, the Russians moved 6 divisions down on the East German Czechoslovakian border. The only thing separating us from them was the river. And at that time, there was only one American division in Germany, the Big Red One, as they call it.
Mm-hmm.
Was like
First Division.
First Division. And a bunch of what they call constabulary units, which were police. And because of that, the Russians, you know, kept making menacing movements and that sort of stuff, kept everybody on edge. So they said, we're going to strengthen the NATO forces with 4 American divisions. And the unit I went with, the 4th Division, which was the Ivy Leagues, as they called it, IB, was the 1st Division to be shipped over. Well, the 1st Division was, you might say, our sponsor. So that when we landed, within 24 hours, we were operational, because they had all of our equipment where it was supposed to be, all of our food supplies, all of our ammunition and gasoline and diesel.
So they'd already planned for you guys to be there.
They'd already planned for us to be there. And we had to do the same thing for the next division that followed us, which was the 2nd Armored Division. We were their sponsor. In fact, I had a 100-man detail that I had to go unload a bunch of stuff off the ship to help get them where they would be combat ready when they landed. And so that was how tense the situation was. And we would have what we call alerts. Never knew when they were going to be. We didn't know whether they were real or not real. And we had pre-designated areas where we were to set up our equipment, our units, and our guns. And it was well coordinated, so that expecting an attack.
Now, can you give me a little background of the overall scheme? So, were the Russians supporting the North Korea during the war, or?
Well, you can't say directly, but they definitely were indirectly.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I know that tensions weren't great between the United States and Russia, especially
Right.
after the end of World War II.
Right.
Things kind of blew up, so
Right.
there was that tension still,
Right.
and that's
Exactly.
why. So they wanted to threaten you guys and hold troops back from
well,
North
you see,
Korea.
What it also what by taking 4 divisions, which could have gone to Korea, they had to go to Germany. So that reduced the number of available troops to fight in Korea.
So that's how they were indirectly
Yeah.
supporting North Korea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So high tension, and could you see the Russians across the river? Was it? I mean, were they?
You could hear them crank their tanks and their equipment up every morning. That's how close we were.
And whenever you'd get into position, when you'd be on alert, would you crank your tank up and go put it in a spot, or what?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm. We would relocate to where we were supposed to be, a strategic point, a high point, so forth and so on.
And how often would that happen? How often do you think you'd get an alert?
Oh, I'd hate to say how often, but it would happen. I'd say probably on the average of probably about every 2 weeks. And but the thing, and even though we would be in barracks at that time, we would rotate to strong points along the river, and we would be there a month at a time, directly across from the German of the Russians, and then we'd rotate back into our barracks, our permanent location, which and for us it was Mannheim, Germany, Sullivan Barracks, and we would do maintenance and so forth, and prepare for the next time we're supposed to go out and that sort of thing.
Now, what was your knowledge of your tank? Could you repair it, or would you have...
We had an ordnance company that was located there in our battalion, and they took care of the heavy stuff. We could do some minor stuff, but not the heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm. And being in Germany, could you still see the scars from World War II?
Well, I had an occasion to see a little bit more of it than most folks. Like I said, I had a 100-man detail that was a sponsor for the Second Army when they were coming over. And Germany at that time was divided into 4 parts: the Russian zone, the American zone, the British zone, and the French zone. And where I had to take that route to unload the material, I had to cross through the French zone and the British zone. And you could tell there was a lot of difference. In other words, in the U.S. zone, there was rebuilding going on and that sort of thing. In the French and the British zone, they pretty well cleared the streets, and that was about it, even in 1951.
Wow. So you spent 2 years in Germany?
Almost.
Almost 2 years. And talk a little more about that incident. So the guy is on the range, they're using it as an artillery, and he actually fires it into the Russian position. And that almost sparked.
It could very easily spark a real bad.
Did it kill any Russians, or did it just?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. I don't know what we hear.
Yeah.
But it could have been very, very serious.
So you took over for him in his position after he was sent out.
And I don't know why, but Colonel Lemoyne always, when we were in bivouac and wanted to move from one location to another, he always wanted me to be the lead platoon for the whole battalion. And doing that, he would send me out to reconnoiter the route we were going to take the tanks home. So we had a little Piper Cub, Lieutenant Newman, I never will forget him. And it was a little reconnaissance plane that we used that we could check out the route and so forth. And in this one particular occasion, this is something that, again, I'll never forget, was we were checking the road, and we were going to have to go across a bridge over a river. And I told myself, well, I could just get anything if I could get a better look at those piers and holding that bridge up, see if they were heavy enough to have to hold our tanks. Because see, the tanks weighed about 4 or 5 tons. And before I knew it, he says, "You're under the bridge."
Under the bridge.
That's right, swing right under that bridge. I never asked you to do that again.
that would scare me.
Yeah, I'll never forget that. Long as I live. But we were married in Germany.
Really?
Yeah. You were not. You couldn't get dependents. No, those dependents were not authorized housing at that time.
Mm-hmm.
In Germany. But I talked to the colonel and told him I wanted to invite my fiance over. We wanted to get married, and lo and behold, I was able to work through the red tape, and we were actually married in Germany, in Heidelberg. In fact, we were married twice.
Huh.
You were required by the German government to have a civil ceremony. You had to have a civil ceremony. A religious ceremony was optional. So we were married by the Burgermeister, the mayor of Heidelberg, in the morning, and by the chaplain on the post in the afternoon.
So she flew out there to be with you?
Yeah, my dad flew with her.
How did you know her before?
Oh, I've known her since she was that high.
Really?
Yeah. You know, we had a family connection. My uncle, by blood, married her first cousin, and that's how we met. Of course, it was through the family situation. But,
that's neat.
Yeah.
What's probably the most memorable thing you remember about being in Germany and the tension, and is there anything that really just sticks out in your mind?
Well, when we had to be on alert, or actually on strong points, when we were out about a month at a time, of course we had to live off of sea rations and all that kind of stuff. Sleep was tough and so forth. But the thing that bothered me the most, I think, is one of my boys had a little Coleman stove that blew up on him and burned him really bad. And I remember I had to go visit him in the hospital after we got him taken care of. But I guess I remember that and everything. There was a lot of turmoil, a lot of tension, and a lot of paper writing, trying to explain what happened and that sort of thing. But, we had a lieutenant in the company next to us. We were all scrambling around and we might get going on alert, and he apparently didn't have his safety on his 45 and shot himself in the hip.
Was he all right?
Yeah, he's all right.
Oh, man.
You know, those are little things that you think about that come back from time to time.
Yeah, but I bet the tension with the Russians was probably, I mean, that was on your mind.
It was always in the back of your mind. And I think the thing that bothered me the most was when I had to go out on the strong point for a month. We rented an upstairs bedroom from an old German couple because we weren't authorized any kind of housing at that time. Now later, just before she came home, they began to let dependents come over. These things had kind of eased up some. But while she was gone, I was always concerned about her safety. While I was out on the strong point, because even though they had a plan where dependents were supposed to gather and fly them out, you never knew whether it was going to work or not.
I know.
But that was, I guess, my biggest concern. When I was out on the strong point was her safety. But she enjoyed it. She took Oma and Opa to visit relatives that they hadn't visited before the war.
Really?
We bought an old used Plymouth that she drove back there. Yeah, she even spent the night in an old castle.
Really?
We had an unusual situation. We had a German doctor and his wife, and we our organization as a battalion, we had a medical officer, but we didn't have any doctors. We had you know, the regular setup for medics, but no doctor. So we actually hired a doctor with the PX funds that we had, and he actually even went on maneuvers with us when we went out in the field. And but his wife and Ruth got to be good friends, and so she would take Ruth to visit some different places. Off how they ended up at a castle one time, spending the night.
So tension started dying down
Towards the in 52.
Mm-hmm. And Korea was the conflict in Korea was
beginning to settle down.
And so you were sent home, and you decided to leave the military. Is that what I understand? Or?
Well, my obligation was over. I never intended. Well, I'll put it back. Take that back. I was approached 2 or 3 times to apply for regular service instead of being a reserve officer, and I considered it. We prayed about it, talked about it, and decided that just wasn't the right way we wanted to go. But I did stay in the reserves. After I came off of active duty, I went on to inactive duty, and I went to summer camps. In fact, I ended up. I went back to school and got a second degree after we got back. And that first summer, I was not assigned to a company, and I had to go for 2 weeks. So I went down to near Savannah, Georgia, to help train a National Guard unit that had just been issued tanks, and teach them how to operate tanks and that sort of thing. So, and then later on, when we were in Knoxville, Tennessee, I was actually assigned to an artillery unit instead of a tank outfit. So, but I did stay in the reserves for 7 years.
And that mostly consisted of you training other people? Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for your time and your interview, Mr. Ashmore.
Well,
Go Tigers.
I hope that was worth the effort.
Yes, sir. It was.